In 2019, an unimaginable ray of light pierced through 18 years of silence and despair for a family in Kentucky. The 2-year-old boy who vanished without a trace from the front yard years earlier was discovered, alive, grown up, and completely unaware that he had once been the haunting name in a forgotten cold case file. Just a short time before that, the truth hit him like a chilling blow. The identity he had carried throughout his life wasn't his own, and the seemingly normal childhood was actually built on a horrifying void. Today I will take you straight into the heart of the tragedy that lasted nearly 2 decades. What really happened on that fateful day in 2001 in the town of Somerset, who took that child away from his biological family, and why no one found a single clue for all those years. This is not just a case of a missing child, this is a chilling story of stolen identity, severed memories, and a life grown up in falsehood that the victim himself had no idea about. It is proof of the dark side of silence, but also the faint light of technology, of perseverance, and of the question that refuses to die. Who am I really? You are the most valuable companions on this journey. Take a deep breath, because right now, we will step together into a story that left America stunned, and your heart unable to stay still. Before diving deep into this haunting real-life case, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love these journeys to uncover truths buried by time, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next story. In 2001, in Somerset in Pulaski County, life moved at a slow and familiar pace, like in any other small town in Kentucky, where everyone knew each other's names, recognized each other's faces, and a sense of safety had become almost taken for granted in daily life. The streets weren't crowded with cars, the houses had wide front yards, kids often played outside under loose adult supervision, and few thought a serious tragedy could happen right in broad daylight. The Taylor family lived in that setting like a normal family. Daniel Taylor was the father with a stable local labor job, accustomed to a regular routine. Laura Taylor took care of the family and maintained a simple lifestyle, with no notable conflicts or any signs of instability that made them stand out in the community's eyes. Their life revolved around work, neighbors, quiet evenings, and repeating habits enough to create a sense of certainty that everything was under control. Thomas Taylor, their 2-year-old son, grew up in that space with habits very typical of a young child, playing around in the front yard, moving within familiar range, responding quickly to his parents' voices, and never having left the adult's sight for too long. The boy wasn't old enough to wander far on his own, nor had there ever been a precedent of him leaving the familiar activity area. The morning of the incident started like any other day, with stable weather, normal family activities, Thomas playing near the house while the adults did their usual tasks, no one feeling the need to change habits or increase vigilance. Before the tragedy occurred, there was a subtle unusual detail that appeared very faintly, enough to be noted, but not enough to trigger an immediate response. The presence of something out of place in the familiar routine, perhaps a stranger, or a vehicle stopping in the wrong spot, fleeting in the adult's view, and quickly dismissed by the long-held belief in the area's safety. The reaction at that moment was brief suspicion, followed by self-reassurance that nothing was wrong, that it was just one of countless random sights in everyday life. The period when Thomas was no longer directly supervised lasted very briefly, just enough for the adults to turn away for a small task, and when attention returned, the child was no longer in his familiar spot. There was no cry, no sign of struggle, no scene indicating an incident had just happened, just the sudden absence of Thomas in the space where he should still have been. The initial reaction was denial, assuming Thomas had just moved to another spot in the area, followed by immediate searching within the surroundings of the house, calling his name, checking familiar places, and quickly expanding the search when there were no results. Neighbors were mobilized, passers-by were asked, initial information was provided, but scattered, inconsistent, and not enough to create a clear direction. Emotions during that time shifted rapidly from hope to worry, from believing the child had just wandered off to fear that something more serious had happened, while all spontaneous search efforts yielded no specific signs of Thomas's location. When it became clear that the ability to resolve the situation had exceeded the family's and surrounding community's limits, Daniel and Laura Taylor were forced to face the hardest decision of that day, officially contacting the police to report that Thomas Taylor, 2 years old, had disappeared, marking the moment when a peaceful day in Somerset was split into before and after, and the Taylor family stepped into a completely different reality from what they had ever known. The decision to contact the police was made in a state of extreme tension, when spontaneous search efforts had quickly proven ineffective, and a sense of unease began to overpower the faint hope that Thomas had simply wandered off in the familiar area. The missing person call was received by the local law enforcement agency's dispatch, where initial information was recorded urgently, but still according to standard procedure for cases of missing children, including the victim's age, last seen time, location, family circumstances, and any unusual details noted earlier. Right from the moment of receipt, the case was classified as high risk due to Thomas's age, because a 2-year-old child has no ability to survive independently for long, if away from adult supervision, and every scenario carried serious risk if the search wasn't deployed promptly. Based on this classification, local police forces were quickly mobilized, with priority on reaching the scene in the shortest time to collect information while witnesses' memories were still fresh and any traces, though faint, hadn't been completely erased by daily activities. When the first officers arrived in the area around the Taylor family home, they faced an unfavorable reality for the investigation. The scene had already been significantly disturbed by the spontaneous search activities of the family and neighbors, something almost unavoidable in the first minutes of such an emergency. Nevertheless, approaching the scene was still conducted systematically, with the immediate goal of grasping the overall picture of the space where Thomas disappeared, determining the child's familiar activity range, and assessing whether the boy could have moved out of that area on his own in the very short time before his absence was noticed. In parallel with surveying the scene, officers began collecting initial information from the family, focusing on foundational details like Thomas's daily habits, usual supervision level, people present in the time before the disappearance, and any factors that could be considered unusual compared to the family's normal routine. Daniel and Laura Taylor were asked to recreate the morning's events as detailed as possible, from when Thomas woke up, activities inside and outside the house, to the last moment they saw their son, with emphasis on determining the exact time frame when Thomas could have left adult control. During this process, officers were aware that the family's psychological state could affect the accuracy of information, so questions were posed in a way to minimize pressure, encourage cooperation, and help the parents focus on providing factual data rather than speculation or self-blame. The initial information showed no precedent of Thomas wandering far from home, no signs of family conflict or disputes that could lead to a scenario involving someone known, but also provided no clear clues about the child possibly being taken by an external factor. Based on this data, officers began forming preliminary investigation directions, including the possibility of Thomas wandering off in the nearby area, being taken by someone familiar with the family, and a random abduction, though the probability of the last scenario was usually assessed as lower in the context of a small town, where social relationships are tight and strangers are easily noticed. Establishing these directions wasn't conclusive, but aimed to create an initial working framework, allowing law enforcement to allocate resources reasonably and determine next steps in the shortest possible time, when every passing minute reduced the chance of finding Thomas safely. At the same time, officers also faced the challenge of balancing speed and accuracy, because acting too hastily on unverified assumptions could lead to hard-to-correct errors later, while delay carried serious consequences for a child too young to protect himself. In that context, the investigation initiation phase unfolded as a series of consecutive decisions, each based on limited information, time pressure, and heavy responsibility for a 2-year-old child's life, marking the point when the case officially left the family's scope and became a criminal investigation file, with all the implications and expectations that the local legal system placed on those responsible for finding Thomas. When the investigation initiation phase ended and preliminary assumptions were formed, focus immediately shifted to the scene where Thomas disappeared, because this was the only space that could provide the first objective data, in a case where human statements were strongly influenced by panic and emotion. The scene was recorded in a state no longer intact, because before authorities arrived, the area around the house had undergone many spontaneous search activities from the family and neighbors, including calling Thomas's name, moving light objects, checking familiar hidden spots, and expanding the search beyond the yard boundaries. Recording the scene therefore wasn't about reconstructing a frozen space, but an effort to understand what had changed, how it changed, and in what time frame, to separate traces potentially directly related to the moment Thomas disappeared from disturbances arising afterward. Officers focused on determining the child's familiar activity range, natural boundaries of the area Thomas could reach under normal conditions, and points that a 2-year-old would have difficulty crossing alone without adult help. In parallel with surveying the space, items and belongings related to Thomas were collected and recorded, not as traditional forensic evidence, but as reference points to determine the child's daily habits and behavior, thereby assessing whether Thomas's absence fit a wandering-off scenario or not. These items showed Thomas had started that day in a completely normal state, with no signs the boy was preparing to leave the familiar area, or being forced in a tense situation, while also providing no direct clues about direction of movement after leaving adult sight. Assessing the scene disturbance level became a crucial step, as it determined the limits of conclusions drawable from the physical space. Officers had to accept the reality that some potential traces, if they ever existed, may have been erased or blurred by initial search activities, and thus investigation focus needed to shift to analyzing the event sequence, rather than seeking a single decisive piece of evidence. From there, the main effort shifted to reconstructing the timeline of the final minutes before Thomas disappeared, based on synthesizing statements from the family, neighbors, and any witnesses present in the area at that time. Reconstructing the timeline wasn't just to determine an exact time frame, but also to understand the area's activity rhythm in that short period, including parallel activities, arrival and departure of individuals not from the family, and small environmental changes that may have been overlooked initially. Time points were continuously cross-checked, with special attention to points where statements didn't fully match, not to assign blame, but to determine the degree of discrepancy due to panic, inaccurate memory, or subjective assumptions from the informant. Through this process, a short but decisive time gap was gradually identified, the period when Thomas was not directly supervised, and also the only phase in which an external incident could occur without immediate detection. This gap wasn't long enough for a 2-year-old to move out of the familiar area, without leaving clear signs, but enough for an intentional action, if executed quickly, and without noise, to happen before adults realized the absence. Identifying this time gap didn't provide a definitive answer to what happened, but it served as a pivot for the entire investigation process, because all subsequent assumptions and directions had to fit within this very narrow time limit. At the same time, it also exposed an unavoidable reality of the early investigation phase, when the scene was disturbed, and data mainly relied on human statements. The decisive minutes could only be recreated indirectly, through eliminating less fitting scenarios, rather than directly confirming a specific event sequence. In that context, the scene and timeline didn't provide an immediate resolution, but they set clear constraints for the investigation, determining what could and could not happen in the time Thomas disappeared, and forcing authorities to approach the case with awareness that any misinterpretation of these final minutes could have long-term impact on the entire process of seeking the truth. The time gap established through crime scene reconstruction and timeline forced the investigation to leave the physical space and shift entirely to people, because at this point, every remaining assumption depended on the statements, behavior, and credibility of individuals directly or indirectly connected to the moment Thomas disappeared. The initial focus was placed on Daniel Taylor, Thomas's father, not only because he was the last person to see the child, but also because the entire chain of events in those critical minutes revolved around his activities and decisions during that period. Daniel's interview was conducted with an emphasis on gathering detailed information rather than seeking inconsistencies, focusing on recreating the sequence of actions, instinctive reactions, and what he perceived in each moment, with the goal of determining the internal consistency of his account, rather than comparing it to a preconceived assumption. The officers asked Daniel to describe the same sequence of events in multiple different ways, at different times during the day, to observe whether the core details changed and whether any minor discrepancies were consistent with a state of stress, panic, and self-blame. Alongside the content of his statements, Daniel's behavior was systematically monitored, including how he responded to difficult questions, his ability to maintain coherent thought, the degree to which he proactively provided information, and his level of cooperation with the investigation, because in missing child cases, the combination of behavior and statements often carries greater analytical value than each element individually. These observations showed no signs of deliberate avoidance, concealment of information, or tailoring the story in a self-serving direction, but instead reflected a psychological state common among parents facing the possibility of losing a child, where guilt and fear often intertwine and make recalling details unstable. At the same time, statements from surrounding witnesses were collected in parallel, including neighbors, people passing through the area, and anyone present within a range that could have observed the Taylor family home at the time Thomas disappeared. These statements were gathered independently to avoid mutual influence, then compared side by side to identify overlapping points that could support a specific assumption, as well as differences that needed to be explained by the individual context of each informant. Most witnesses described a normal morning, with no event striking enough to be deeply etched in memory, which both aligned with the initial assessment of the area's tranquility and created a major challenge for the investigation, since the absence of clear recollections often means that any important details, if present, passed unnoticed at the time. Some statements mentioned unusual elements such as the appearance of unfamiliar people or vehicles, but this information lacked precision in timing, location, and direct connection to Thomas, making it difficult to use as a foundation for a specific investigative direction. To assess the value of each statement, the investigators considered the personal circumstances of each witness, including their position at the time of the incident, their familiarity with the Taylor family, the likelihood of being distracted by other activities, and the risk of memory being influenced by informal community discussions afterward. This evaluation aimed to filter out information likely distorted by speculation or social influence, while retaining even minor details that could serve as additional pieces in the overall picture. Another parallel line of analysis involved checking the background and family relationships of Daniel and Laura Taylor, including marriage history, financial situation, social relationships, and any factors that could create stress or potential motive for harm to Thomas. This work relied not only on official records, but also on gathering information from the community, to ensure no serious issues had been hidden or downplayed. The results showed that the Taylor family had no history of domestic violence, no records of social services intervention, and no conflicts significant enough to explain a 2-year-old child disappearing under these circumstances. Ruling out domestic violence was done cautiously, because in criminal investigations, exclusion does not mean absolute certainty, but it was sufficient to shift the analytical focus away from the family and force investigators to take external factors outside the familiar framework more seriously. Nevertheless, The interview and witness evaluation phase also exposed the clear limitations of human data in the context of a rapidly occurring incident with no clear physical traces, where memories are dominated by emotion and social environment, and behavior can only be interpreted within the bounds of general patterns. The ultimate outcome of this phase was not a solution, but a controlled narrowing of possibilities, in which some scenarios were eliminated due to lack of basis, while others remained as unanswered questions, continuing to pressure the investigative process and maintaining the tension that had enveloped the case from the moment Thomas disappeared. The absence of signs of domestic violence combined with the lack of specific leads from interviews and witness evaluation forced the focus of the case to shift entirely to organized search efforts, where the goal was no longer analyzing assumptions, but conducting field operations at the highest possible scale and intensity, under the given conditions. An official search campaign was established involving local police, rescue teams, medical personnel, specialized support units, and a large number of community volunteers, all placed under a unified command structure to ensure every activity followed the same plan and information flow remained cohesive. Mobilizing these forces not only reflected the severity of the case, but also the shared recognition that time was the decisive factor, especially for a 2-year-old child who disappeared without clear signs. Search teams were assigned specific tasks from the start, with some focusing on ground sweeps in the immediate area around the Taylor home, others tasked with checking more complex terrain such as wooded areas, overgrown fields, ditches, and remote open land, while a separate unit handled collecting and processing tips provided by the public during the operation. Area division was based on practical principles related to a small child's mobility range, combined with specific geographical features of the location, thereby identifying high-probability zones to check first. These zones were clearly marked on maps with defined boundaries and priority order, to avoid multiple teams covering the same spot, while others were overlooked. Each team was required to document in detail what had been checked, the time spent searching, and the results, even if nothing was found, to create a comprehensive picture of the covered search area. Search dogs were deployed as a key component, with the expectation that scent tracking could provide a specific direction, or at least confirm whether Thomas had moved on the ground after disappearing. The K9 units worked under difficult conditions, as the scene had been disturbed with overlapping scents from searchers, but they were still used systematically, focusing on areas deemed least affected. In parallel, support equipment such as off-road vehicles, lighting gear, long-range radios, and observation tools were utilized to expand access to hard-to-reach areas and maintain effective coordination between teams. Search radius expansion was done incrementally, each step tied to re-evaluating initial assumptions, particularly the possibility that Thomas wandered off on his own, because if that scenario were true, the failure to find traces in an ever-widening area would gradually become hard to explain. Each expansion decision involved allocating additional resources and time, while raising questions about the practical limits of a search campaign based primarily on the assumption that the victim remained in the area. Throughout this process, community tips continued to come in at high volume, reflecting public anxiety and desire to contribute, but most were speculative, stemming from vague sightings or uncertain memories, requiring investigators to spend time verifying them without proportional results. Coordination between search teams was maintained tightly through quick briefings and ongoing reports, but practical limitations became evident as the operation dragged on, from participant fatigue, terrain and environmental challenges, to mounting psychological pressure as each area was marked cleared without new leads. Nevertheless, the campaign continued at high intensity in the early phase, because slowing down or stopping too soon could be seen as missing the only chance to find Thomas safely. Reality grew heavier as all priority areas were thoroughly checked with no direct signs of the child found, no discarded items, no clear scent trail to follow, and no new credible witnesses providing information that could shift the search direction. The lack of results in such a large-scale operation forced participants to confront a troubling possibility that whatever happened to Thomas lay beyond the scope of a standard field search. For the Taylor family, each passing hour without news increased feelings of despair and helplessness, while for investigators, completing sweeps without concrete leads created pressure to rethink the entire approach to the case. The official search phase ended in a state of high tension, not because all possibilities had been exhausted, but because reality showed that continuing the search in the same pattern would not yield different results, leaving behind a frightening void between the efforts already made and the unanswered question of how Thomas disappeared and where he was. The failure of the official search campaign to produce results forced the investigation to shift to a different phase, where the focus was no longer on sweeping physical spaces, but on processing, evaluating, and filtering a large volume of information pouring in from the community, local media, and other indirect sources. Calls, emails, and direct tips were continuously received, most involving sightings of strangers, unfamiliar vehicles, or behavior deemed unusual around the time Thomas disappeared, reflecting the community's collective effort to find meaning in the smallest details of everyday life. Investigators faced the challenge of distinguishing genuinely valuable information from leads arising from anxiety, speculation, or memories distorted by time and emotion, a task requiring both patience and professional discipline to avoid being drawn into unproductive directions. Every tip about a suspicious person or vehicle was recorded, categorized, and checked through a set procedure, including verifying timing, location, description, and potential connection to the Taylor family's area, to assess how well it fit the previously established time gap. Most leads, after thorough checking, showed no timing match or could not place Thomas in the same space as the described subject, resulting in their elimination without significantly impacting the overall picture. However, this very process of elimination played a crucial role in narrowing the investigation, as each discarded lead helped clarify what did not happen, thereby highlighting the remaining scenarios even as they grew fewer. In this context, some information, though not strong enough to become evidence, was retained as potential reference points, especially reports of unfamiliar vehicles in the quiet residential area, at a time when Thomas's absence might have occurred. Handling these required careful judgment, as pursuing them too deeply could waste precious resources, while ignoring them entirely risked missing a critical detail. Based on the filtered data, investigators began prioritizing certain investigative hypotheses, not because they were firmly proven, but because they better fit what had been ruled out up to that point. The hypothesis that Thomas wandered off on his own gradually lost credibility, as no physical traces were found in such a wide area, while the hypothesis of external intervention, though lacking direct evidence, began to be taken more seriously, because it could explain the rapid disappearance without signs. In this prioritization, some other investigative directions were downplayed, not because they were impossible, but because they did not align with existing data, or required additional hard-to-verify assumptions given limited resources. Downplaying these directions reflected a common reality in criminal investigations, where decisions must be based on relative probability and feasibility, even if that means accepting the risk of overlooking a less likely scenario. This approach gradually formed a consistent mindset within the team, where new information was evaluated through the lens of prioritized hypotheses, rather than considered entirely independently, a process that could speed up handling, but also increased the risk of bias. As leads continued to be checked and eliminated using the same logic, a form of investigative bias began to form subtly, not from a single wrong decision, but from the accumulation of many reasonable short-term choices that were limiting in the long term. The initially prioritized hypotheses gradually became the anchor for all subsequent analysis, causing information that did not fit to be easily downplayed or explained in a less significant way, even if the information itself was not entirely worthless. This process occurred naturally amid pressure for results, community expectations, and constraints on time and resources. But it also gradually narrowed the investigative mindset. The formation of bias did not mean the investigation stalled immediately. Rather, it created inertia in the approach where new questions were asked less often, and old hypotheses were challenged less over time. In Thomas's case, this bias manifested in some scenarios being viewed as too unusual or socially unacceptable in the context of a small town, and thus not receiving proportional resources to fully explore. At the same time, the lack of specific physical evidence made adjusting hypotheses difficult, as no new data was strong enough to force the team to completely change direction. As a result, the phase of handling leads and investigative hypotheses brought a degree of clarity through eliminating many possibilities, while also laying the groundwork for limitations that could have long-term impact on how the case was perceived and handled. As decisions made under uncertainty gradually became premises hard to question in the subsequent steps of seeking the truth. Investigative biases began to take shape from the clue processing stage, causing the expansion of the investigation to occur within a framework that was both proactive and constrained, where authorities attempted to move further away from the initial scene but could not fully escape the assumptions that had been prioritized earlier. One of the first expansion steps was screening individuals with prior criminal records in the area and surrounding regions, particularly those previously involved in violent acts, child abuse, or offenses involving unlawful entry, with the goal of determining whether any of them were present or moving near the Taylor family's location at the time Thomas disappeared. This screening relied on available local databases, combined with information from neighboring units, but quickly revealed limitations when many records were not fully updated or lacked details about the subject's movements during the specific time period. These checks largely yielded no clear results, as although some individuals with prior convictions lived in the broader area, there was no evidence showing they had any direct connection to the Taylor family or were present within the determined range of the critical time gap. In parallel with screening subjects, the investigation team examined major and minor traffic routes around the area, including local roads, town entrances and exits, and connections to nearby regions, to assess the possibility that Thomas could have been taken out of the area in a very short time frame. This work involved gathering information from frequent users of these routes, reviewing stops, parking areas, and locations where a vehicle could pull over without drawing attention. But the lack of modern traffic surveillance systems meant the process depended almost entirely on residents' memories and willingness to cooperate. The information obtained from this line of inquiry was not specific enough to create a reliable trail, as most of it simply confirmed that traffic in the area was normal, and no event stood out enough to be clearly remembered. Coordination with state-level agencies was implemented to a certain extent, primarily to share case details and check for similar reports in other areas during the same period. But this coordination was limited by jurisdiction, priorities and resources of each unit, as well as the fact that the case did not yet have sufficient elements to be elevated to a federal-scale investigation. Information exchange was more consultative than joint action, and although it broadened the case's perspective beyond the local scope, it did not produce new leads capable of driving the investigation toward a breakthrough. Another key factor affecting this entire phase was the technological and budgetary constraints of 2001, when data analysis tools, electronic tracing, and interconnected databases were not as developed as they would later become, making it difficult and time-consuming to connect scattered pieces of information. Most investigative work still relied on paper records, manual communication, and human ability to synthesize information, which not only slowed progress but also increased the risk of overlooking weak but important connections. Limited funding also forced the investigation team to make difficult decisions about resource allocation, prioritizing certain lines of inquiry while reducing or temporarily halting others, even when their possibilities could not be fully ruled out. These decisions were often made amid pressure from the community and Thomas's family, who expected clear progress after each investigative phase, creating a conflict between the need for swift action and the demands of professional caution. As expanded efforts continued to yield no concrete results, a sense of an invisible wall began to emerge within the investigation team, where every direction seemed to lead back to the starting point without producing a new breakthrough. The failure to uncover new trails not only reflected the absence of leads, but also highlighted the limitations of the current approach, which was dominated by assumptions formed in the early days and constrained by available tools and resources. In that context, each expanded investigative step became heavier, requiring more effort for lesser results, increasing the risk of material and emotional exhaustion for those involved. For the Taylor family, the prolongation of this process without specific progress deepened their feelings of helplessness and disorientation, while for the investigation team, it raised unavoidable questions about whether the case was entering a phase where current tools and methods were no longer sufficient to continue. The expanded investigation phase thus ended in a suspended state, where all efforts had been deployed within permitted limits, but produced no new leads, leaving an unexplained case stuck between the desire to uncover the truth and the very real limitations of investigative conditions at the time. The prolonged stalemate of the expanded investigation phase, combined with the absence of any new leads strong enough to redirect the process, gradually forced authorities into a difficult but unavoidable adjustment, in which active investigative activities began to be scaled back both in frequency and scope. Scene searches were no longer conducted regularly. Subject and traffic route checks were narrowed to periodic waves rather than maintained continuously, and resources that had been mobilized at peak levels were reallocated to other emerging cases in the area. This slowdown did not happen abruptly, but occurred step by step, reflecting a shift from emergency status to passive monitoring, where Thomas's case still existed in the system, but was no longer the top daily priority for the investigating agency. Along with the decline in active operations, large-scale official search campaigns were halted, not because all possibilities had been exhausted, but because continuing searches in the same pattern would not yield different results, while the costs in manpower, finances, and morale were becoming increasingly hard to justify. Areas that had been searched multiple times were no longer rechecked, search teams disbanded, and the heavy presence of authorities in the community gradually disappeared, leaving both a tangible and intangible void for those accustomed to the urgency of the early days. Internally, Thomas's case was moved from active status to archive status, with all files, reports, statements, search maps, and related documents organized, packaged, and placed into regulated storage. This process was administrative but carried deep symbolic meaning, as it marked the point when the case was no longer treated as an ongoing situation, but became a collection of data, awaiting a new factor strong enough to reactivate it. Thomas's file was officially classified as an unresolved missing child case, a label that was both technical and contained an implicit acknowledgement that with the tools and information available, the investigative system could not go further. This classification brought specific changes in how the case was handled, from reducing the frequency of periodic reviews to transferring follow-up responsibility to units specializing in backlogged files, where hundreds of similar cases lay in limbo. For the Taylor family, this shift was not announced with a clear official statement, but was felt gradually through the growing infrequency of contacts, the absence of new updates, and the sense that their child's case was no longer in the main flow of investigative activity. Calls that once happened regularly became rare, responses grew shorter and more procedural, and promises to keep searching were gradually replaced by vague assurances that the file remained open in the system. This change created a widening gap between the family and authorities, not due to lack of goodwill, but because the structure of the investigative system required prioritizing cases with clearer potential for progress. In that context, Thomas existed in databases as a name, a photograph, a brief description of the disappearance date and circumstances, updated periodically per procedure, but untied to any field action. The lack of regular investigative updates forced the Taylor family to confront a new form of uncertainty, no longer the acute fear of the early days, but a prolonged fragile hope mixed with the feeling of being left behind by the very system they had relied on. For the investigators, moving the case to cold case status did not mean abandonment, but a realistic acknowledgement that all feasible options within the current framework had been pursued without results, and that any future progress, if it came, would have to come from a new source of information, different technology, or an unexpected factor beyond what had been considered. Nevertheless, the decision carried considerable psychological weight, as it marked the end of a period of continuous effort, and the beginning of an indefinite time in which the case existed in passive waiting, with no timeline, no clear roadmap, and no promise of outcome. As the pace of investigation slowed, and public attention gradually shifted to other stories, Thomas's disappearance became part of the community's fading collective memory, mentioned occasionally, but no longer present in daily life. For the Taylor family, this meant continuing to live in a reality where the questions of where Thomas was, and what had happened to him, were no longer asked daily by those around them, yet remained as an unfillable void, an enduring silence reinforced by the very shift of the case, from a living present to a cold file buried deep in the storage system. The prolonged silence, after the case was moved to archive status, created two parallel lives, one lying dormant in the cold files of authorities, and another continuing to flow in a completely different place, where Thomas grew up carrying no memory or awareness of his real name. In another state, far from Kentucky and detached from the community where he was born, Thomas entered a new living environment, with rules, habits, and relationships that had no obvious connection to his severed past. Life proceeded at its own pace, tied to a foster family that in his eyes was his entire world, from housing and schooling to behavioral and emotional norms. That environment appeared stable on the surface, enough for a child to develop physically and integrate into everyday life, but it also laid the foundation for invisible gaps related to identity. As he grew up without a clear story about his personal origins, without shared memories of early childhood milestones, and without ties to a specific lineage or family history, the caregiver played a central role in shaping Thomas's daily life, providing care, discipline, and behavioral patterns that he accepted as natural, but the relationship was built on an incomplete foundation of information, where questions about origins were often met with evasion, simplification, or silence. In the early years, this lack of information did not create obvious conflict, as young children typically accept the world as presented, and what was left unsaid gradually became part of the default context, without needing explanation. However, as Thomas grew older, anomalies in his personal records began to surface, not as stark contradictions, but as small details that did not quite align when placed alongside his actual life. Documents related to birth date, place of birth, or other administrative information were more generic than usual, lacking the supporting data typically seen in a child born and raised within the same system, creating a vague sense of the past that was not easily recognized as abnormal in the early years. The educational environment Thomas entered did not provide additional clarity to these gaps. As to the school and surrounding community, he was simply a student, with minimally valid records, and no clear signs of legal or administrative issues requiring intervention. Nevertheless, the absence of a clear origin story gradually became a subtle influence on how Thomas viewed himself, especially as he began to notice differences between himself and others, who could easily talk about where they were born, their biological family, and early memories, preserved and confirmed by multiple sources. Questions arose not as an immediate crisis, but as a recurring series of doubts, triggered by ordinary social situations, where knowing where one comes from becomes part of belonging and connection. Thomas's personal records, when viewed as a whole, reflected a subtle inconsistency between administrative data and lived experience, not severe enough to trigger intervention by authorities, but sufficient to create a feeling that something did not fully match. These anomalies existed alongside what appeared to be a normal life, where Thomas built social relationships, adapted to his surroundings, and developed the skills needed to function in the new community, yet always carried an unnamed void, a part of the past unconfirmed by anyone beyond his own vague sense. The lack of information about personal origins extended beyond documents to the way family stories were told, or not told, to the silences that appeared when the past was touched upon, and to the absence of living witnesses who could verify what happened before the point where his conscious memory began. The new living environment was thus both a place of safety and stability, and a space where questions of identity hung suspended, unanswered but not entirely denied, creating a fragile balance between acceptance and doubt. For Thomas, this balance lasted for many years, enough for him to build a self-image based more on the present than the past, but not enough to completely extinguish the feeling that part of his story had been omitted or obscured. The small scattered anomalies in his personal records gradually became subtle signs, connecting in his awareness, not leading to a specific conclusion, but sufficient to sustain a prolonged state of skepticism, where his current identity was accepted as daily operational reality, while his true identity, if it existed, remained out of reach, unnamed and unconfirmed by any system or person. The vague gap in identity continued to linger as Thomas delved deeper into his childhood years in the new living environment, where daily living conditions were maintained at a level sufficient to create an outward sense of stability, but never truly filled the invisible deficiencies related to personal origins. His daily life was organized around familiar activities such as going to school, returning home, participating in community events, and interacting with those around him, all unfolding in a steady rhythm that gradually blended the initial abnormalities into the general normalcy. The home where Thomas grew up met basic needs for food, shelter, and daily activities, creating a space that from the outside could be perceived as a stable family, with no clear signs of disruption or deprivation. However, this very stability concealed important details that Thomas was unable to recognize in his early years, because a child can only understand the world through what is provided to it, and what is not mentioned is often considered non-existent. The relationship between Thomas and his foster family was built on daily care and dependence, in which the caregivers played the role of parents in every practical aspect of life, from transportation and behavioral guidance to establishing moral and emotional standards. This attachment was more functional than based on shared history, as it was not reinforced by collective memories or family stories passed down through time, but primarily relied on the present and repeated interactions. In that environment, Thomas learned to adapt, to read the emotions of the adults around him, and to avoid asking questions that received no clear responses, a self-regulation mechanism common in children raised in contexts with limited information. The gap in personal background did not appear as a major crack immediately, but gradually revealed itself through very ordinary life situations, such as school assignments requiring stories about family, gatherings where others mentioned grandparents or relatives, or occasions needing confirmation of personal information beyond basic data. In those situations, Thomas could often only provide vague answers, not because he intentionally hid anything, but because he himself had no additional information to share, and this deficiency gradually became a familiar part of how he interacted with the world. The absence of clear verifying documents about personal origins meant that much of the information in Thomas's administrative records existed in a minimal state, sufficient to meet basic system requirements, but not enough to create a complete picture of his background. Documents related to date of birth, place of birth, and family relationships did not directly contradict each other, but they were also not supported by supplementary evidence such as initial medical records, hospital papers, or witnesses who could confirm key milestones in early life. This inconsistency was not significant enough to trigger intervention by authorities in a system accustomed to handling numerous cases of minor documentation shortcomings, especially in contexts where the foster family provided a stable and cooperative outward appearance. For Thomas, these administrative irregularities were not clearly perceived in the early stage, as he lacked a frame of reference for comparison and access to information to question them himself, but they gradually accumulated into an indefinable sense of difference. This difference did not stem from being treated differently in an obvious way, but from small moments when he realized he could not answer questions that seemed simple to others, and that there were parts of his life story not confirmed with certainty by anyone. The relationship with the foster family, therefore, existed in a state that was both close and distant, where daily care and dependence did not fully transform into a complete sense of belonging, due to the lack of a shared historical foundation to anchor that relationship. The silences that arose when past topics were touched upon were not always recognized as signs of intentional concealment, but were often explained as difficulty in expression or a desire to avoid complex subjects, an approach that Thomas gradually learned to accept to maintain stability in his living environment. This contributed to forming an adaptation strategy, in which he focused on the present and near future, limiting deep exploration of questions without clear answers, while simultaneously making the gap in background more enduring over time. In the school and social environment, Thomas developed the necessary skills to integrate, building friendships and participating in group activities, but these relationships rarely reached the depth of personal stories, as he himself lacked sufficient data to share. The continued absence of clear verifying documents about personal origins remained a background factor, not causing immediate crisis, but creating invisible barriers to fully accessing rights and opportunities, especially as more complex administrative procedures began to appear with growing up. These barriers were often resolved temporarily with flexible solutions, enough to overcome specific situations but never addressing the root of the problem, leaving the lack of background information as an inseparable part of daily life. Over time, Thomas learned to live with that deficiency, not by fully accepting it, but by setting it aside as an unanswered question, focusing on what he could control and build in the present. However, this very process of coexistence made the abnormal signs clearer as he entered new developmental stages, where understanding who he is and where he comes from began to play a more important role in shaping personal identity. Thomas's childhood without records, therefore, was not just a phase lacking administrative information, but a prolonged experience of existing in limbo, where life was maintained and developed on an incomplete foundation, and where questions about background continued to quietly accumulate, awaiting a future moment when they could no longer be ignored as easily as before. The gaps that simmered throughout Thomas's childhood without records gradually turned into more specific and harder to ignore signs as he entered the stage where personal identity was no longer just an internal feeling, but became a factor examined, compared, and required to be verified by external systems. The contradictions in personal documents did not appear all at once or in a shocking way, but emerged layer by layer through seemingly ordinary situations where Thomas was forced to provide information about himself and realized that the data did not fully match. Some administrative documents recorded information at a minimal level, sufficient to be procedurally valid but lacking foundational details commonly seen, such as newborn medical records, birth certificates confirmed by a hospital, or supporting documents reflecting early life stages. These shortcomings were not always viewed as violations, but when placed alongside the complete records of peers, they created a clear difference in completeness. Thomas's date of birth, though consistently recorded on some documents, was not supported by initial medical or administrative data, making it exist as a more approximate timeline marker than an event confirmed by multiple independent sources. Information about place of birth and birth circumstances was also general, not tied to a specific location or a sequence of events that could be traced back, which is rare in records built fully from the start. These contradictions became clearer when Thomas had to face situations requiring deeper verification, where having just one document recording information was no longer enough to answer follow-up questions. Information about family, especially blood relations, also existed in an inconsistent state, as answers provided were often general, lacking detail and unable to expand when Thomas tried to learn more. Names, places, or important timelines in the story of his origins either did not exist or were mentioned disjointedly, not forming a coherent narrative that could be verified. This inconsistency lay not only in the lack of information, but also in how the information was presented, as the same detail could be told in different ways at different times, creating a sense that there was no fixed version of the story. The contradictions in documents and accounts began to prompt questions about origins, no longer vague emotional doubts but specific questions about where Thomas really came from, why the most basic information could not be consistently confirmed, and what happened before the point where his conscious memory began. However, Thomas's ability to cross-check these questions with actual data was severely limited, as he had no access to original records, did not know which system held that information, and was not equipped with the knowledge or support needed to independently conduct a verification process. Efforts to understand often stopped at asking questions of those around him, and when those questions received no clear answers, they were easily pushed aside as unsolvable issues. The lack of ability to cross-check stemmed not only from administrative limits, but also from a prolonged socialization process where Thomas learned that digging into the past was not encouraged and could cause tension in current relationships. This led him to gradually form a self-censorship mechanism, keeping identity questions internal rather than pursuing them fully. In that context, contradictions in personal documents continued to exist unresolved, each appearance reinforcing the feeling that part of the truth was obscured or never fully recorded. These experiences began to affect how Thomas viewed himself, as identity was no longer taken for granted but became a fragile structure built on incomplete data and unverifiable stories. Each time he had to use personal documents in official contexts, Thomas faced a subtle unease, not from fear of being discovered as fraudulent, but because he was uncertain which version of his life story was accurate. The inconsistency in family information also weakened the ability to form a clear sense of belonging, as without confirming blood ties or family history, placing himself in a continuous flow of generations became difficult. Signs of mismatching identity, therefore, were not just administrative issues, but gradually spread to psychological and social realms, shaping how Thomas interacted with the world around him. He became more cautious in sharing personal information, avoiding conversations that could lead to deeper questions about origins, and learned to maintain a stable enough version of his story to avoid unwanted attention. However, this stability was more defensive than resolutive, as it did not eliminate the contradictions but only pushed them into a latent state. Over time, small contradictions accumulated into a prolonged sense of doubt, where Thomas no longer fully trusted the documents or stories provided, but also lacked enough basis to reject them. The lack of ability to cross-check left him stuck between two states, accepting the current identity to continue living, while carrying a deep suspicion that it might not reflect the full truth. This in-between state created a complex psychological foundation, where each mismatching sign, however small, had the potential to reactivate the chain of questions about origins, and where personal identity was not experienced as a solid anchor, but as a structure awaiting verification. Signs of mismatching identity thus became a central element in Thomas's inner life, not exploding into immediate crisis, but quietly shaping how he understood himself and his place in the world, maintaining a prolonged state of doubt, where the truth about origins remained an unanswered, unconfirmed question that he could not yet clarify on his own. The simmering doubts about identity that had existed as a vague background layer during childhood and adolescence gradually became impossible to ignore. As Thomas entered adulthood, the time when personal decision, legal responsibilities, and self-awareness began to tie closely to understanding who he is and where he comes from. Transitioning to a new life stage brought a series of practical demands, from education, work, social relationships to more complex administrative procedures, all requiring a certain level of clarity about identity that Thomas had never truly possessed. The contradictions that once caused only mild discomfort now began to create specific pressure, as each time he had to fill in personal information, confirm background, or explain family, Thomas faced the feeling that his story was incomplete and could not be independently verified. Entering adulthood also meant Thomas had more space to reflect on his own past, no longer completely dominated by the foster family environment or previously imposed information limits. Questions that had been set aside for years began to return with greater intensity, no longer vague guesses but a real need to investigate background, as identity now related not just to personal emotions, but directly influenced how he shaped his future. That need did not arise from a single event, but from the accumulation of many small experiences, where Thomas realized that continuing to live with gaps in origins would become increasingly difficult as he made long-term life decisions. However, as the need to understand background became clearer, Thomas simultaneously faced an unfavorable reality: no specific reference records to start the verification process. The documents he had were only enough for basic life requirements, but provided no clues leading back to early life, no clear names of blood relatives, no specific traceable birth location, and no known data system to connect those scattered pieces. The lack of reference records was not just a technical obstacle, but also created a psychological barrier, making the search for origins vague from the starting point, with no clear path and no guarantee that effort would lead to any answers. In that context, Thomas had to weigh continuing to accept an incomplete identity to maintain current stability against actively confronting questions that could disrupt the entire life he had built. This weighing lasted, as deciding to search for origins affected not only Thomas himself, but also surrounding relationships, especially with the foster family, who had played a central role in his life, despite being unable to answer the deepest questions. Adulthood brought Thomas more autonomy, but also placed on him the responsibility to face the consequences of every choice alone, including the possibility of discovering unwanted or unchangeable truths. The absence of reference records meant every thought about searching for origins started from nearly zero, forcing Thomas to rely more on intuition and personal feelings than on specific data. The identity doubts, once suppressed to fit daily life rhythm, now became an inseparable part of the maturation process, as understanding who he is felt like a necessary condition to move forward with confidence and stability. In this phase, Thomas began to realize that not knowing origins was not just lacking information, but lacking the ability to place himself in a broader context of personal and social history, something many around him took for granted. The feeling of standing outside family stories, lineages, and collective memories became more pronounced, making the need to establish identity no longer an optional choice, but an increasingly strong internal demand. Despite no specific reference records, Thomas gradually formed the awareness that continuing to avoid origin questions would only prolong uncertainty, while actively searching, though full of risks and uncertainty, at least offered the possibility of accessing truth. The decision to search for origins was not made in an impulsive moment, but the result of a prolonged thought process, where Thomas weighed what he had against what he felt was missing, between current stability and the deep need to understand himself. Adulthood gave him enough distance to look back at his entire journey, from mismatching identity signs in documents to prolonged feelings of difference in social relationships, all converging into a clear realization that an important part of his life story remained untold. In the context of no reference records and no clear guidance, the decision to search for origins became an internal turning point, marking the moment Thomas no longer accepted living with gaps as an unchanging reality, but chose to confront them as an issue needing clarification. This decision did not come with a specific plan or clear roadmap, but simply the acceptance that asking questions and seeking answers, no matter how difficult, was necessary for Thomas to step further into adult life with a greater sense of wholeness about his own identity. The decision to no longer avoid the gaps in his origins led Thomas to explore tools he had never previously considered seriously. In a context with no reference records, no living witnesses, and no reliable family stories to follow, a consumer DNA test gradually emerged as one of the very few viable paths remaining. Approaching the DNA test did not begin with firm confidence that it would provide answers, but from the realization that traditional methods were no longer sufficient to resolve the doubts that had lingered for years, and that modern biotechnology could offer an entirely different perspective, independent of told stories or administrative documents that had already revealed numerous inconsistencies. Thomas researched DNA testing in a society where such services were becoming increasingly common, advertised as tools for discovering personal origins, connecting distant relatives, and reconstructing genealogies, but for him, its meaning went far beyond ordinary curiosity, as it represented the first opportunity to access a form of data not dependent on human memory or anyone else's willingness to provide information. Considering a DNA test came with many hesitations, not only because of the cost and process, but also because of the potential consequences the results might bring, including the possibility of completely upending everything Thomas believed he knew about himself and his current life. Preparing personal information for the test became a symbolic step, as it forced Thomas to compile everything he knew about himself, from his recorded name and birth date to his current residence and the scant details related to his upbringing. And in doing so, he realized the significant limitations of this information compared to the complete personal records he had seen in others. The preparation was not just administrative, but also psychological, as each field filled in raised questions about its accuracy, forcing Thomas to confront head-on the reality that many details in his personal record were accepted as truth only because there was no alternative. When the decision to proceed with the test was made, it did not resemble an impulsive or dramatic moment, but rather a cautious yet unavoidable step, taken with the clear awareness that, regardless of the outcome, continuing to live in a state of prolonged doubt was no longer an acceptable option. The process of conducting the DNA test followed standard steps, from collecting the biological sample to sending it for analysis, but for Thomas, each step carried its own psychological weight, as it marked the shift from asking questions to actively seeking answers based on scientific data. Sending the sample for testing meant handing over the determination of part of his identity to an anonymous analysis system, where results would be processed and returned without being influenced by personal stories, emotions, or social relationships, an idea that brought both hope and deep anxiety. During the waiting period for results, Thomas entered a particular psychological state where anticipation and unease coexisted, as each passing day carried the possibility that a crucial piece of his life was about to be revealed, but it could also confirm that the search for origins would not become simpler after this step. The extended waiting time created space for Thomas to reflect on different scenarios, not as specific predictions, but as abstract possibilities about what directions the DNA results might open, from finding no clear connections to discovering completely unexpected ones. Each possibility carried its own consequences, not just in terms of information, but in how Thomas would have to adjust his perception of himself and his current relationships. In this phase, waiting was not merely a temporal void, but became a transitional period where Thomas stood between two states of identity, one version of himself, built on what he had lived and been told, and a potential version that could be reshaped by biological data. This waiting also highlighted the difference between knowing and being confirmed, because although Thomas already had strong suspicions about his identity, they existed only at the level of feeling and speculation, while the DNA test results promised an objective confirmation he had never had. At the same time, this phase forced Thomas to confront the question of how ready he was to accept the truth, regardless of whether it aligned with or contradicted his expectations, because searching for origins was not just a journey of gathering information, but also one of psychological preparation for potentially profound changes. Waiting for the DNA results in a context with no other reference points made every thought about the future feel temporary, as if Thomas was pausing major decisions until he had more data to better understand himself. In that state, the DNA test was no longer merely a consumer service, but became an internal turning point, where Thomas for the first time placed trust in science as a tool capable of piercing the silence of the past and providing a new starting point for his life story, even if that starting point might lead to paths entirely different from what he had imagined. The waiting period for the DNA test results ended with the arrival of an entirely new dataset, bearing no narrative voice, emotion or assumption, but existing as numbers, ratios, and statistical connections that forced Thomas to approach his life story from a perspective he had never had before. Analyzing the DNA results did not happen as an instant explosive moment, but as a process of reading, understanding, and interpreting layers of information, where each match opened new lines of thinking while closing off some old possibilities. The genetic markers showed that Thomas had clear biological connections to individuals who did not appear at all in his current personal records, connections close enough that they could not be explained by random coincidence, yet distant enough not to immediately point to a simple answer about identity. These results confirmed something Thomas had long suspected: his current identity did not fully reflect his true biological origins, and his life story was missing an important part beyond what was known. From the initial DNA matches, the process of building a family tree began like a complex jigsaw puzzle, where each genetic relationship was placed into a broader structure to determine Thomas's relative position in a family network he had never known. Building the genealogy was not immediately personalized, but relied on algorithms comparing degrees of genetic matching, closeness of kinship, and gene distribution patterns in specific populations, gradually forming potential family branches. As these branches expanded, and were cross-referenced with accompanying geographic information, one factor began to emerge consistently: many genetic connections shared a common geographic origin, concentrated in a specific area of the United States. Discovering these connections was not an immediate confirmation, but it was enough to draw Thomas's attention, as the indicated area did not match where he grew up and lived, hinting at a completely different past. As the data continued to be analyzed, and the genealogy branches refined, the connection to Kentucky became clearer, not as a single point, but as a center where many genetic connections converged. The repetition of this geographic factor exceeded random chance, making the assumption of a biological origin tied to Kentucky increasingly weighty. For Thomas, this discovery held special meaning, as it provided the first specific coordinate for the question of where he might have come from, rather than existing only in the vague space of abstract possibilities. Linking the DNA data to geography also raised a new series of questions, no longer centered on whether his current identity was accurate, but shifting to how his true identity might have been separated from him, and under what circumstances. These suspicions did not emerge as firm conclusions, but as a logical structure gradually forming, where pieces of genetics, genealogy, and geography began interacting to create a picture that was increasingly hard to ignore. The formation of suspicion about his true identity was not based on a single piece of evidence, but the result of multiple independent indicators pointing toward a potential conclusion that Thomas might have been born into an entirely different family, in a different location, and the story leading to him growing up under his current identity might involve a serious rupture in the past. Realizing this possibility did not bring relief, but placed Thomas in a new state of tension, where the question was no longer whether to search for origins, but how to face the consequences of what the data was suggesting. The family tree continued to expand and adjust, with each new connection added clarifying Thomas's relative position in the potential biological family network, while highlighting the complete absence of these individuals in the story he had been told. The gap between scientific data and lived experience became stark, as the numbers and genetic charts began telling a different story from the life narrative Thomas was familiar with, forcing him to consider the possibility that his entire foundation of identity might need re-evaluation. Discovering the connection to Kentucky was not just a geographic detail, but became an anchor for the process of restructuring perception, as it suggested that Thomas's life story did not begin where he had believed, and that a different social, family, and historical context awaited exploration. Even without any official confirmation of his true identity, the convergence of genetic and genealogical factors was enough to make this possibility impossible to ignore, shifting the suspicion from a personal assumption to a line of thinking supported by data. In that context, the DNA results were no longer neutral information, but became a catalyst, forcing Thomas to re-evaluate his entire journey, from the gaps in personal documents to the prolonged feeling of difference in social life, all now placed in a new frame of reference, where science began filling the silences of the past. The formation of suspicion about his true identity was thus not the end of a process, but the opening of a new phase of awareness, where genetic data provided clues strong enough to challenge what had been taken as obvious, and placed Thomas on the threshold of a truth capable of reshaping his entire life story. The increasingly clear suspicions formed from the DNA results and genealogical analysis could no longer be kept as a purely personal search process, because as the scientific indicators began converging on a specific area, time period, and social context, Thomas understood that only the official system could place this data in its proper position within a larger picture. The decision to submit the DNA information to authorities did not stem from certainty that he had found the final answer, but from the realization that the journey to the truth had exceeded the limits of a single individual, especially when the possibility of his true identity was linked to an unresolved missing child case. This process required Thomas to face a significant psychological turning point, as submitting personal data to the investigative system meant accepting that his life story could be examined, analyzed, and verified by complete strangers, following procedures unaffected by emotion or personal desires. The DNA information was compiled along with preliminary genealogical analyses, identified genetic connections, and facts about geographic origins, forming a file that was more suggestive than conclusive but clear enough for authorities to understand that this was not a baseless speculation. When this data was received, it was entered into the process of matching against missing children records, a system existing between technology and memory, where each record represented a disrupted life and a family without complete answers. The matching process was not simply searching for overlaps in names or dates, but a complex series of cross-references between DNA, demographic characteristics, age at the time of disappearance, historical timelines, and geographic factors, to determine whether the new biological data could place Thomas in the same space-time as any existing record. In this phase, Thomas's information was treated as an unidentified identity case, separated from his personal story, to ensure that all conclusions were based on objective data, rather than being led by the desire for answers. As algorithms and analysts began screening the data, most missing children records were quickly ruled out, due to mismatches in age, timing, or genetic origins. But this elimination process simultaneously highlighted a few remaining cases where matching factors appeared at higher than normal levels. Among them, one record began to stand out, not because of a single detail, but because of the convergence of multiple independent factors, from corresponding age range and disappearance timeline, matching the DNA data to geographic location, aligning with the Kentucky area, previously indicated by genealogical analyses. This record documented a 2-year-old child who went missing in circumstances without a definitive resolution, with administrative information and personal descriptions specific enough to allow deeper cross-referencing, yet incomplete enough to explain why the case had remained stalled for years. When Thomas's DNA data was placed alongside that record, the genetic indicators showed compatibility exceeding random chance, not enough for automatic identity confirmation, but strong enough to form a serious investigative hypothesis that Thomas could be the child recorded under the name Thomas Taylor. The discovery of this match was not announced or confirmed immediately, as in the official process, every possibility must undergo multiple rounds of verification to rule out errors, mistakes, or rare coincidences. Experts began reviewing the entire original missing person file, from family information and disappearance circumstances to details collected in the initial investigation days, placing them in relation to the new data to assess consistency. This cross-referencing highlighted points previously overlooked or unexplained at the time, which now gained more meaning under the light of DNA and genealogical data. For Thomas, knowing that his data was being compared to a specific missing person record created an indescribable psychological state, where hope and anxiety coexisted, as the possibility that he might have been missing in the past meant there was another family that had lived for years in waiting and pain. Preparing to reopen the case did not happen as a simple decision, but as the result of weighing legal responsibility, data reliability, and potential impact on involved parties. Authorities had to determine that the degree of match was significant enough to justify reactivating a case classified as a cold case, while ensuring that every subsequent step followed proper procedure to avoid unnecessary harm. Internally, this preparation included reassessing the file's status, identifying documents needing review, and considering options for official identity verification if the match hypothesis continued to strengthen. The entire process took place in a cautious space where no one rushed to conclusions, as the consequences of a wrong decision could be lasting and profound. For Thomas, the phase of cross-referencing missing person records marked the moment when his personal journey to find origins officially entered a new dimension, where the question of identity was no longer just internal or consumer science, but had become a legal and investigative matter. Discovering the match with the Thomas Taylor record did not bring immediate relief, but opened another tense waiting period, where the truth seemed very close yet still required final verification steps for official confirmation. In that state, every piece of data, decision, and action was carefully considered, because once the file was reopened, it not only had the potential to re-identify Thomas, but could also close a long chapter of silence and uncertainty that had lasted for years, while laying the foundation for broader consequences that no one at this stage could fully predict. The convergence of DNA data, genealogy, and missing person records forced the investigative system to shift from a cautious stance to official action, as the case could no longer be treated as an isolated hypothesis, but had reached the threshold requiring handling at a higher level. The state-level investigative agency took over the case in the context that this was not just an ordinary missing child file, but a case involving identity determination after many years with the support of modern technology, necessitating coordination among specialized units in forensics, data analysis, and criminal investigation. The takeover was not formalistic, but came with reassigning responsibilities, expanding access to records, and establishing a task force tasked with comprehensively reviewing both the new data and all previously collected old documents. In this phase, the focus was not only on confirming whether Thomas matched the missing person record, but also on evaluating how the case had been handled in the past, what had been done, what had been overlooked, and which assumptions had dominated the initial investigation process. The process of cross-referencing DNA, images and timelines was implemented as a rigorous series of cross-checks in which Thomas's biological data was compared not only with existing stored samples but also with indirect genetic information from potential biological relatives identified during the genealogy construction. Concurrently, archived images from the original missing person file, including childhood photos, physical descriptions, and identifying features, were placed alongside Thomas's current images, not to seek absolute similarity, but to assess a reasonable level of consistency according to biological development laws. The timeline of the disappearance was reconstructed once more, this time incorporating the new data, to determine whether Thomas's life timeline could seamlessly fit into the gap that had existed in the cold case record. Every time marker, from the recorded disappearance date to the years when Thomas appeared in the administrative system under a different identity, was analyzed to rule out unexplained overlaps or irreconcilable contradictions. This process was conducted with a high degree of caution, as identity confirmation was not merely a scientific conclusion, but also a legal decision that could trigger a series of consequences related to personal rights, family relations, and the responsibilities of public authorities. As the independent layers of comparison began yielding consistent results, from DNA and genealogy to timeline and identifying features, Thomas's identity confirmation gradually shifted from an investigative hypothesis to a well-founded conclusion. However, this confirmation was not rushed, but underwent multiple internal reviews to ensure no errors in the analysis process and that every possibility of mistake had been considered and excluded to the highest possible degree. Alongside identity confirmation, the investigative agency proceeded to re-evaluate the entire old missing person file, not just to update information, but to understand why the case had remained stalled for so many years. Reports, statements, search records, and investigative decisions from the early days were re-examined from a new perspective, where modern data allowed visibility into gaps and limitations that could not previously be identified. Some assumptions prioritized in the past were questioned, not to assign blame, but to determine whether any avenues had been overlooked due to technological limitations, resources, or the social context of that time. Re-evaluating the old file also included examining how information had been stored, classified, and communicated across different phases of the case, to ensure all relevant data was fully assembled for the new processing stage. For the investigative system, reopening the cold case was not just about resolving a specific matter, but also a test of the system's ability to self-correct and learn when confronting past limitations in the context of modern standards. For Thomas, this phase held particularly profound meaning, as it marked the moment when his identity was no longer in the ambiguous zone between suspicion and possibility, but was being placed into an official confirmation process with the involvement of competent authorities. However, this confirmation did not bring an immediate sense of closure, but opened a complex transitional state where Thomas had to prepare mentally for his past to be recreated, analyzed, and placed under public light in ways he could not fully control. Reopening the file also required considering the psychological impact on all involved parties, especially those who had been attached to the case in the past, from the family of the missing child to individuals who had participated in the initial investigation. Therefore, every step was taken within a strict framework, with coordination among investigative, forensic, and psychological support units, to ensure the identity confirmation and file re-evaluation process was conducted responsibly. In that context, reopening the cold case was not merely reactivating an old set of documents, but the initiation of a new investigative phase based on modern data and technology foundations, where truth was approached not through intuition or assumption, but through multi-layered verification methods. This phase ended when Thomas's identity was confirmed to a sufficient degree to proceed with subsequent steps in the system, while completing the review of the old file to prepare for the important decisions that would follow. In that state, the case officially emerged from years of archival silence, entering a new chapter where past and present intersected, and where identity confirmation was no longer an open question, but the foundation for broader consequences awaiting ahead. The official confirmation of Thomas's identity did not close the case, but instead opened a new investigative phase with an entirely different focus, where the question was no longer who Thomas was, but what had truly happened in the many years of gap, and why the investigative system at that time had been unable to reach an answer. Authorities began re-evaluating all the initial assumptions that had directed the 2001 investigation, placing them under the light of existing data to assess their reasonableness and the consequences they had created for the case processing progress. Assumptions once considered reasonable in the context of that time, from the scenario of Thomas wandering off on his own to disappearance due to random factors in a small community, were reanalyzed to determine whether they were based on actual evidence or primarily stemmed from speculation, pressure to quickly establish an investigative direction. This process did not aim to pursue individual accountability, but focused on understanding how assumptions formed, were reinforced, and gradually became the cognitive framework dominating all subsequent decisions, from resource allocation to clue evaluation. When placing those assumptions alongside the confirmed DNA, genealogy, and timeline data, some initial directions clearly revealed weaknesses, not because they were entirely baseless, but because they were prioritized too early and not fully verified through independent methods. Analyzing the 2001 investigative misdirections became an important step in this phase, as it allowed investigators to better understand the systemic limitations that had affected the ability to uncover the truth at that time. Factors such as limited technology, lack of interconnected databases, heavy reliance on statements, and subjective observations, along with pressure from the community and media, were examined as variables that had contributed to narrowing the initial investigation's thinking space. Some clues once excluded or not pursued to the end were re-evaluated, not to assert they definitely had value, but to determine whether overlooking them was a result of cognitive bias or simply due to lack of evidence at that time. In the context of Thomas's clarified identity, old decisions were viewed no longer as isolated choices, but as a linked chain of reactions, where each step was influenced by the previous one, creating an investigative inertia difficult to reverse. Concurrent with analyzing the past, the investigative agency had to confront a highly practical question: whether identity confirmation opened the possibility of pursuing a perpetrator, and if so, to what extent under current conditions. Evaluating the feasibility of pursuing a perpetrator was done cautiously, based on examining what remained after many years, from physical evidence and witness statements to administrative and social traces that could be retraced. Reality showed that most physical evidence, if it ever existed, was no longer present or had not been preserved to standards allowing reanalysis with modern technology, while witness memories, already faint from the start, had become even less reliable after many years. However, confirming that Thomas had lived under a different identity for a long time also opened new questions about the chain of events after his disappearance, including where he had been taken, by whom, and through what path. Questions that might leave indirect traces in administrative, medical, or social systems in subsequent years. Investigators had to weigh pursuing these possibilities against the reality that each passing year significantly reduced the ability to collect evidence of legal value, especially in cases not initially handled as organized crime. Evaluating the feasibility of pursuing a perpetrator was therefore not blindly optimistic, but based on balancing potential and limitations to determine where resources should be allocated and in which direction to avoid creating unrealistic expectations. In this process, investigators also had to clearly define current investigative limits, not only regarding evidence, but also legal authority, statutes of limitations, and interagency cooperation possibilities. Some actions, though ethically or socially wrong, might have exceeded criminal statutes of limitations, while others, if they occurred, might not leave traces strong enough to meet current legal proof standards. Defining investigative limits did not aim to close off the possibility of seeking justice, but to establish a realistic framework for what could and could not be achieved, avoiding prolonging an investigation unlikely to yield specific results. At the same time, acknowledging limits allowed the system to focus on more feasible goals, such as clarifying the sequence of events at a historical and administrative level, rather than attempting to reach an unprovable criminal conclusion. In that context, the supplemental investigation after confirmation became a process, both inward and outward facing, where the investigative system looked back at itself to draw lessons from past misdirections, while soberly assessing action capabilities in the present. For Thomas, this phase held complex meaning, as it raised expectations that identity confirmation could lead to clarifying the full truth, but also forced him to confront the possibility that some questions would never have complete answers. Reevaluating initial assumptions and analyzing investigative misdirections served not only operational goals, but also acted as a way for the system to acknowledge its limitations, something rarely expressed publicly in long-drawn cases. This phase thus existed as an intermediate space between past and present, where truth was approached not only through the desire to find a perpetrator, but through efforts to better understand how a case could slip from the system's control under specific conditions. When the evaluations were complete, the picture that emerged was not a clear path to criminal justice, but a set of limited possibilities, open questions, and valuable lessons about how missing child investigations had been, were being, and needed to be conducted. In that state, the supplemental investigation after confirmation did not close the case in the traditional sense, but redefined its objectives, shifting focus from seeking a perfect ending to achieving the highest possible level of clarification within the framework of what time and reality allowed. The cautious evaluations and supplemental investigative steps after confirmation gradually converged into a decisive conclusion, as all scientific, administrative, and investigative data were placed side by side to answer the core question that had hung unresolved for many years. Thomas was alive. This confirmation was not issued as a standalone statement, but as the result of a multi-layered verification chain, in which Thomas's identity was confirmed through DNA, genealogy, image comparison, and timeline, sufficient to rule out confusion with any other case in the system. When the conclusion that Thomas was alive was officially recorded, it simultaneously closed the assumption that had quietly persisted for many years that the missing child might have died, an assumption not always publicly stated, but one that had profoundly influenced how the case was handled and prioritized in the past. Closing this assumption held meaning, not only operationally, but also cognitively, as it forced the investigative system to acknowledge that a pessimistic scenario, once accepted as highly likely, did not reflect reality, and that limitations in technology and investigative methods at that time had contributed to maintaining this erroneous assumption. Summarizing the investigation results became a key step in which the entire process, from the moment Thomas disappeared, the initial search phase, the case falling into cold case status, to identity redetermination, thanks to modern technology, was strung together into a logical and consistent report. This summary did not aim to retell the story in an emotional way, but to create an official document accurately reflecting what had been verified, what could not be verified, what could not be verified, and what had changed due to new data. In the summarization process, investigators had to clearly distinguish between conclusions proven by evidence and assumptions remaining at the level of possibility, to avoid extending conclusions beyond the scope of existing data. Completing the identity verification procedures for Thomas was conducted concurrently with summarizing results, including updating missing children databases, adjusting the file's legal status, and ensuring all related systems reflected the newly confirmed reality. These procedures were administrative, but held broad significance, as they officially ended Thomas's existence in the system as an unresolved missing child, replacing it with an individual whose identity and survival status had been determined. This update also required coordination across multiple agency levels, from local to state, to ensure no contradictions or overlaps in related files. In that context, the investigation conclusion was not understood as a simple endpoint, but as a conditional closure, where some key questions had been definitively answered, while others were recorded as unsolvable within the framework of existing evidence. Confirming Thomas was alive allowed the investigative system to close a long chapter of uncertainty, but also required transparency about remaining limitations, particularly regarding fully determining the sequence of events during the years Thomas lived under a different identity. In the conclusion report, investigators clearly noted that although identity had been verified, not every detail of the process by which Thomas left his original family and grew up elsewhere could be fully reconstructed, due to lack of physical evidence, reliable witnesses, and complete administrative data from that period. Acknowledging these limitations did not weaken the main conclusion, but instead strengthened its integrity, as it showed the system did not attempt to make assertions beyond what the data allowed. The investigation conclusion also included evaluating the impact of this confirmation on past assumptions and decisions, not to assign individual blame, but to draw systemic lessons about how missing child cases needed to be handled, stored, and re-examined long-term. In particular, the role of DNA technology and genealogy databases was recognized as a breakthrough factor, enabling access to truths once beyond the reach of traditional investigative methods. Completing verification procedures also opened the need to update how the system classified and tracked similar cases in the future, to minimize the risk of a surviving case going unrecognized for many years. For Thomas, the investigation conclusion held meaning far beyond administrative scope, as it officially confirmed that the suspicions lingering throughout his life were not products of imagination or subjective feeling, but had real and scientific basis. However, the conclusion report was constructed to minimize emotional elements as much as possible, focusing on recording verified facts and accompanying legal and administrative consequences, to ensure the document could withstand any future reviews. In the completion process, investigators also considered how to announce the conclusion to ensure system transparency, while minimizing unnecessary negative impact on involved individuals and families. The investigation conclusion was thus shaped as a structured endpoint, where the case was officially closed at the investigative level, with clear answers about Thomas's status, while leaving open aspects that time and circumstances had made clarification impossible. When the final procedures were completed, the case file was updated to a new status, reflecting the shift from an unresolved missing child case to one with determined identity and survival, marking the end of a many-year investigative journey. In that state, the investigation conclusion was not just an administrative document, but an affirmation that the system, despite past limitations and errors, still had the capacity to self-correct and access truth when appropriate tools emerged. Closing the child death assumption and confirming Thomas was alive, thus became the foundation for officially ending the case at the investigative level, while creating a foundation for involved parties to move to subsequent phases with a truth clarified to the highest possible degree within realistic constraints. Once the investigation was concluded, and Thomas's identity had been confirmed to the necessary legal and professional standard, the process had to move into a far more sensitive phase where the focus was no longer on data or records, but on the people who had lived with the loss for nearly 2 decades. Contacting the Taylor family was not done abruptly or in a simplified manner, because the authorities understood that the information about to be delivered was not merely informational. It had the potential to upend the entire emotional structure and daily life of those who had been asked to accept uncertainty for so long. Before any official contact took place, the family file was reviewed again to ensure that contact information was accurate, up to date, and appropriate to the current context, as in the intervening years the Taylor family had undergone significant changes in residence, living circumstances, and family structure. The choice of method and timing of contact was carefully considered, with the goal of minimizing unnecessary shock while ensuring that the information was delivered by individuals with sufficient authority and skill to handle any emotional reactions that might arise. When contact was established, the initial focus was not on immediately announcing the verification results, but on confirming the recipient's identity, assessing their current psychological state, and preparing an appropriate space for communicating the important news. The announcement of the verification results was not presented as a simple statement, but placed within a clear explanatory context about the investigative process, the verification steps taken, and the degree of certainty of the conclusion to prevent the information from being misunderstood or perceived as an unverified rumor. The authorities had to balance transparency in conveying the truth with controlling the pace of the information so the family could absorb it piece by piece, because for them, this result was not just the answer to a question that had lingered for years, but a reversal of the assumptions, hopes, and ways they had learned to live with loss. The Taylor family's reaction was not treated as something to be controlled, but recognized as an inseparable part of the notification process, requiring patience and appropriate support from those representing the investigative system. During this process, preparing for an in-person meeting was identified as a necessary next step, not to satisfy curiosity or create a symbolic moment, but to ensure that all parties involved had the opportunity to access the information in a controlled environment, where legal, psychological, and logistical factors were fully considered. This preparation included assessing the desires and readiness of both the Taylor family and Thomas, because even though the identity had been confirmed, directly confronting the past and severed relationships was not something that could or should happen immediately. The authorities acted as coordinators, not only in arranging the time and place, but also in ensuring that the parties had access to necessary support, from psychological counseling to legal guidance, to minimize the risk of harm during this particularly sensitive phase. Coordinating the related procedures became a complex task, because confirming Thomas's identity triggered a series of administrative and legal requirements, from updating civil registry records to determining the rights and obligations of the parties involved in the new context. These procedures had to be carried out alongside the notification and meeting preparation process, but without overshadowing or interrupting the family's emotional processing, because the ultimate goal was not just to complete paperwork, but to facilitate a responsible transition from missing person status to confirmed status. In the coordination process, the authorities had to clarify the boundaries between what could be resolved immediately and what required time, especially regarding re-establishing family relationships that had been interrupted for so long. Notifying the Taylor family also required transparency about the limitations of the investigation results, because although Thomas's identity had been confirmed, not every question about the lost years could be fully answered. This was to avoid creating unrealistic expectations that identity confirmation equated to a complete explanation of every aspect of the past, something the investigative system itself acknowledged was unattainable under current conditions. Throughout the notification and preparation process, the role of the authorities was not merely to deliver information, but to act as intermediaries, ensuring that the information was conveyed accurately, responsibly, and with maximum respect for the family's experience of living in uncertainty for many years. Every step was documented and carefully coordinated, because any error in this phase could cause new trauma, compounding the old losses. As the related procedures were gradually arranged and the Taylor family was provided with all necessary information, a new state of waiting emerged, not the hopeless waiting of before, but the waiting for a meeting that had the potential to redefine the concept of family for all involved. For the Taylor family, being told that Thomas was alive was not just confirmatory news, but the opening of an entirely new phase, where they had to learn to accept a reality different from what they had grown accustomed to over nearly 2 decades. For the investigative system, this phase represented a special responsibility, where closing the case was not measured solely by the investigative conclusion, but by whether the information was delivered, and the procedures coordinated in a way that helped reduce trauma and facilitated reconnection. In that context, notifying the family was not a mere procedural step, but a core part of resolving the case, where the accuracy of the information, sensitivity in communication, and caution in coordination all played a decisive role in how this story would continue to be lived and understood in the stages to come. The state of waiting that formed after the Taylor family was officially notified gradually turned into a concrete process, as the legal, psychological, and logistical conditions reached the level that allowed an in-person meeting between Thomas and his biological family to be organized, an event not viewed as the end of the case, but as the most profoundly human transitional step in the entire journey. Organizing the meeting was not done hastily, or as a mere symbolic gesture, but built on careful consideration of the space, timing, and appropriate context, to create an environment safe enough for the parties to face each other without pressure from the public or media. The authorities coordinated with psychological experts to assess each side's readiness, because even though the identity had been confirmed on paper and through DNA, the direct meeting remained a potential emotional shock for both Thomas and the Taylor family, who had lived in 2 completely different realities for many years. In the preparation process, confirming the blood relationship was reiterated as a foundational element, not to reinforce existing belief, but to ensure that all participants clearly understood the scientific certainty of the conclusion, thereby reducing the risk of doubt or misplaced expectations in the moment of meeting. This helped shift the focus of the meeting from the question of whether Thomas was truly their biological child to the far more difficult question of how people who were strangers in terms of life experience could begin to rebuild a relationship based on the newly confirmed truth. When the in-person meeting took place, it was not as dramatic as in the fantasies that had persisted for years, but unfolded in a heavy, cautious atmosphere filled with silences, where every gesture, glance, and reaction was felt with great intensity. There was no preset script for how the parties should behave, because no one had experience facing the reunion of a family member missing for nearly 2 decades in the form of an adult with a completely different identity, memories, and life. Confirming the blood relationship in this context was not just acknowledging the DNA results, but a process in which each side tried to connect the scientific data with intuitive perception, unconsciously searching for similarities in appearance, mannerisms, or voice as a way to make the truth more acceptable. For the Taylor family, this moment brought both relief from knowing Thomas was alive and a resurgence of painful memories of the day he disappeared, creating a complex emotional state where joy and pain coexisted inseparably. For Thomas, the meeting placed him in an unprecedented position, where the people before him were both biologically related and complete strangers relationally, forcing him to adjust his understanding of the concept of family that had been shaped during his years, growing up under a different identity. Beginning the reconnection process did not happen as an immediate action or clear decision, but as a series of small, cautious, and experimental interactions, where the parties sought to establish new boundaries appropriate to the current reality. No one expected the nearly two-decade gap to be filled in a single meeting, and this very acknowledgement helped reduce the pressure to create a complete relationship immediately. Instead, reconnection was understood as a long-term process, starting with sharing basic information about current lives, listening to the stories that had shaped each person, and gradually determining the level of attachment each side felt able to accept. Assessing initial psychological reactions became an essential part of this phase, because outward expressions did not always fully reflect what was happening inside. Experts monitored how Thomas responded to direct contact, from comfort level in communication to signs of stress or avoidance, to determine the necessary support to help him process this major change in a healthy way. The Taylor family was similarly assessed, because meeting Thomas again could trigger long-suppressed emotions, from guilt and regret to fear of loss once more, all of which needed to be identified and handled carefully. Throughout the reunion process, the role of the authorities and experts was not to control or dictate how the parties should feel, but to create a safe framework in which natural reactions could occur without causing long-term harm. This included establishing breaks when needed, ensuring the meeting did not exceed anyone's endurance, and providing post-meeting support resources to prevent emotions from surging without an outlet. The reconnection process was therefore not measured by strong emotional displays or symbolic declarations, but by the parties' ability to accept the situation's complexity and allow the relationship to develop at its own pace. In that context, reunion was not understood as Thomas simply returning to the Taylor family, but as the formation of a new relational structure, where biological identity was acknowledged but did not deny the reality that Thomas had lived a different life before the truth was revealed. Assessing initial psychological reactions also helped the parties recognize that difficulties ahead were inevitable, and that feeling confused, conflicted, or even distant in the early stage did not mean the reunion process had failed. On the contrary, acknowledging those emotions as a natural part of reconnection helped reduce the pressure to achieve an ideal family image, allowing each person to find their place in the new structure without having to completely abandon what had shaped them over the years. When the meeting ended, there was no clear sense of completeness or closure, but rather the opening of a longer journey, where the parties had to continue learning to understand each other in the new context. For Thomas, reunion did not erase the years lived under a different identity, but it provided a new anchor for his life story, where the truth about his origins was placed alongside his lived experiences to form a more complex but honest identity. For the Taylor family, meeting Thomas again confirmed that their years of waiting had not been entirely in vain, but also required them to accept that the person before them was no longer the 2-year-old child who disappeared, but an adult individual with autonomy and his own history. In that context, reunion became a deeply human turning point, not because it resolved every issue, but because it allowed the parties to begin facing the truth together, in an open process where connection was built gradually rather than assumed to be natural or immediate. The reunion marked an important emotional turning point, but also opened a complex and prolonged aftermath phase, where the real consequences of Thomas being found began to manifest clearly in every aspect of personal, family, and social life. Adjusting legal identity became one of the first and unavoidable tasks, because Thomas had existed in the administrative system for many years under a different identity, with valid documents tied to the life he had built. This adjustment process was not simply a matter of changing name or personal information, but a complex series of procedures involving civil registry, citizenship rights, medical records, education records, and other legal obligations, all of which had to be updated to reflect the confirmed biological identity, without disrupting Thomas's current rights and benefits. The authorities had to balance restoring the original identity with protecting the stability of the life Thomas was familiar with, avoiding administrative disruptions that could add further pressure during an already turbulent period. Adjusting legal identity also raised sensitive questions about which identity Thomas would use in the future, whether the biological identity would completely replace the old one, or the two would coexist in a flexible legal structure, reflecting the reality that Thomas's personhood was formed from both distinct life stages. Alongside the legal procedures, the need for psychological support for all involved parties became clearer than ever, because finding Thomas did not close old wounds but often reopened them in a new context. For Thomas, having to redefine himself after his biological identity was confirmed, created a profound inner challenge, where he had to reconcile the person he had become with the person the system, biological family, and society now expected him to be. Conflicting emotions, ranging from relief and curiosity to anxiety and disorientation, emerged interwoven and without a linear sequence, requiring professional support to be processed healthily. The Taylor family also faced their own psychological consequences, because recovering Thomas did not erase the years of grief and guilt, but forced them to adjust their view of the past and present, accepting that Thomas's return did not mean reverting to the time before the tragedy. Psychological support therefore focused not only on individuals, but extended to the entire family structure, helping members learn to communicate, set realistic expectations, and build new relationships based on respect for differing life experiences. The impact of media and society quickly became an unavoidable factor, as the story of Thomas being found after many years missing attracted widespread attention, turning a personal journey into a public event with diverse interpretations, commentary, and expectations. Media interest had the positive effect of recognizing the efforts of modern technology and the investigative system, while giving the sense that this story held meaning beyond one family. However, it also created considerable pressure on Thomas and the family, as their private lives were scrutinized, analyzed, and sometimes simplified into a symbolic narrative that did not fully reflect the complexity of the real experience. Facing the public forced the parties to make decisions about how much information to share, weighing the right to tell their own story against the right to be protected from excessive intrusion, a balance difficult to achieve when societal curiosity was at a high level. The authorities and support experts played a regulatory role, helping Thomas and the family understand the long-term consequences of media exposure, while establishing necessary boundaries to protect mental health and long-term stability. Adapting to the new life became a prolonged process with no clear endpoint, where Thomas had to learn to live with a restructured reality, without denying what had shaped him in the preceding years. The new life involved not only re-establishing relationships with his biological family, but also adjusting existing social relationships, where Thomas had to decide how much of his true story to share and in what manner. This adaptation occurred while Thomas still had to maintain personal responsibilities and goals such as work, education, and private relationships, making the identity restructuring inseparable from everyday practical demands. The Taylor family also had to adapt to their new role, no longer merely people waiting for a missing child, but relatives of an autonomous adult, forcing them to adjust how they expressed affection and concern so as not to inadvertently impose expectations rooted in the past. The societal impact of the case was also evident in how the surrounding community began to rethink the concepts of missing and found, recognizing that finding someone after many years did not equate to a simple happy ending, but the start of a complex phase requiring many resources and understanding. In that context, the aftermath of finding Thomas was not measured by powerful emotional moments or symbolic images, but by the ability of those involved to build a new state of balance in daily life. Adjusting legal identity, psychological support, managing media impact, and adapting to the new life were interwoven, forming a series of ongoing challenges that could not be resolved by a single decision or action. For Thomas, This phase represented learning to own his life story in an honest and sustainable way, accepting that his identity was formed from multiple layers of different experiences, and did not need to be simplified to fit an easily told mold. For the Taylor family, the aftermath of finding Thomas was the process of learning to love and connect in a new structure, where loss and recovery coexisted as inseparable parts of family history. On a broader scale, this phase showed that resolving a missing person case does not end with finding the victim, but extends to supporting the parties in adapting to the revealed truth, a task requiring time, patience, and long-term coordination among individuals, family, and society. The gradual stabilization of Thomas and the Taylor family's adaptation did not mean that every question surrounding the case had been closed, because once the legal procedures were completed and the new life began to take shape, an unavoidable reality had to be acknowledged. Certain core issues remained beyond the investigative system's ability to resolve. The most significant among them was the failure to identify the abductor, a gap that had persisted from the moment Thomas disappeared to the present, and even though the victim's identity had been confirmed, there was still not enough evidence to fill it. The fact that Thomas grew up under a different identity clearly showed intentional human intervention in the past, but the specific chain of actions that led to his removal from the Taylor family, as well as the identity and motive of the person or persons involved, could not be reliably reconstructed after nearly 2 decades. The investigators, despite re-examining initial assumptions and reassessing errors in the 2001 investigation, still had to face the reality that most physical traces no longer existed. Any potential witnesses could no longer provide reliable testimony, and potential administrative clues had been scattered or lost over time. In that context, the inability to identify the abductor was not a consequence of lack of effort in the present, but the inevitable result of the combination of past technological limitations, the way the case was initially handled, and the irreversible passage of time. The absence of criminal prosecution was closely tied to this gap, because the legal system could not proceed with charges without a specific suspect, direct evidence, or the ability to meet the required standard of proof. Even in hypothetical scenarios where an individual might be suspected, investigators had to strictly consider statutes of limitations, the legality of circumstantial evidence, and the risk of harming uninvolved people if a criminal investigation were launched without a solid foundation. The lack of criminal prosecution was therefore not viewed as giving up, but as a decision based on the rule of law, where the system accepted its own limits to avoid creating new injustices in the effort to correct an old one. However, this acknowledgement did not lessen the sense of incompleteness for those involved, because for the Taylor family, and Thomas himself, not knowing who was responsible for the years-long separation was an existential question, not easily soothed by procedural explanations. The limits of investigation after such a long time became a central theme in how this case was perceived, because it clearly exposed the gap between what society expects from justice and what the system can actually deliver in reality. Time not only faded memories and destroyed evidence, but also changed the legal, social, and technological context, making it extremely difficult to apply modern standards to past events. Investigators had to work with records created in an era when data storage, sharing, and analysis had many limitations, while facing the fact that many initial decisions, though reasonable at the time, had inadvertently closed doors that could not later be reopened. Clarifying these limits was not intended to justify past shortcomings, but to provide a realistic view of how time affects the ability to seek truth, thereby helping society understand that not every case can reach a complete resolution in the traditional sense. In that context, Thomas's case carried meaning beyond the personal. becoming a typical example of the inherent challenges in handling long-term child abduction cases. Its significance for other child missing cases lay in the fact that this story both demonstrated the potential of modern technology in resolving seemingly hopeless files and emphasized the insurmountable limits when key elements were not preserved from the start. The fact that Thomas was found through civilian DNA testing and genealogical analysis proved that tools outside the traditional investigative system can play a decisive role in reviving cold cases, especially when the victim has grown up and can actively seek their origins. At the same time, the inability to identify the abductor and proceed with criminal prosecution was a clear reminder that technology, no matter how powerful, cannot fully compensate for the gaps created by time and initial handling. The case raised important questions for the investigative system and society at large about how to prioritize, store, and re-examine child missing cases, particularly in maintaining open assumptions and preserving evidence to the maximum extent, even when there is no progress for a long time. It also highlighted the role of family and individuals in keeping a case from completely disappearing from collective memory, because if Thomas had not actively sought his origins as an adult, his true identity might have remained dormant in databases forever without ever being connected. On a broader view, the unresolved issues in this case challenged the way society often tells resolved stories, where finding the victim is sometimes seen as a complete happy ending. Thomas's reality showed that being found is only part of the story, and that questions about responsibility, motive, and justice can persist alongside the confirmed truth. This forces policymakers, law enforcement agencies, and the community to view child missing cases with greater complexity, where success is not measured only by the number of cases closed, but also by how the system learns from its own limits to reduce the likelihood of recurrence in the future. For Thomas and the Taylor family, accepting that there will never be full answers to every question is part of the long-term adaptation process, where the truth about identity and survival is placed alongside the absence of criminal justice as two sides of the same reality. The inability to identify the abductor and the lack of prosecution do not diminish the value of finding Thomas, but they reshape the meaning of this story, shifting the focus from seeking a perfect ending to acknowledging the inherent complexity and incompleteness of many long-term cases. In that context, the unresolved issues are not a sign of complete failure, but evidence of the very real limits of people and systems when facing time, uncertainty, and loss. They simultaneously serve as an important reminder that every child missing case, whatever its outcome, carries lessons that need to be remembered and applied, so that similar gaps in the future can be narrowed, if not with absolute certainty, then at least with an earlier and more comprehensive ability to approach the truth for families living in waiting. Thomas Taylor's story shows that today's America is both safer thanks to technology and more fragile because a single moment of inattention can create a gap that lasts a lifetime. In Somerset in 2001, the tragedy began with exactly what many American families still trust: a small town, a sense of familiarity, and just a few minutes of unsupervised time in the yard. The first lesson is to design safety as a system rather than relying on feeling. Lock gates, simple doorbells, camera, clear adult shift rules for watching children, teach children early safety reflexes, stand still, call parents' names, do not follow strangers even if enticed. The second lesson comes from the investigation itself. The scene was disturbed by spontaneous searching, making thin traces even thinner. Therefore, in the first hours, search quickly around the house while trying to keep things untouched. Record with phone what is seen, especially strange vehicles, strangers, direction of running. The third lesson lies in the fact that Thomas grew up off the record and only as an adult began questioning inconsistent paperwork in modern America. Paperwork and data are the safety net. Parents and guardians should periodically check children's birth, medical, and school records. Adults with doubts about their origins should seek legal and psychological support, and carefully consider tools like civilian DNA testing. Finally, the story reminds us that being found is not yet the end. The Taylor family needs psychological support, legal identity adjustment, and media management. The practical lesson is to prepare a support network, therapy, lawyer, and media boundaries, so that reunion does not become a second shock. If you find that Thomas Taylor's story shows that truth can be buried for a very long time, but still one day be uncovered, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue together, following decoded cold cases and fates that seem to have vanished forever. Thank you for staying with us to the end of this journey, and see you in the next video, where another story will continue to remind us why we should never stop seeking the truth.